So planting perennials and shrubs and trees is one of the absolute most important parts of establishing a garden. And as you can see, just by taking a wander through my sort of garden area, I have a lot of different perennials and shrubs and things. And right now it looks a bit bare because we're in the springtime, you can see a lot of dirt. But in the summertime, this will all fill out really nicely and you won't be able to see any of that at all. So I thought it'd be a good idea to make a little guide on how I plant my perennials, how I plant shrubs, and also how I plant trees. We're talking about things in pots, like some of these over here, rather than things that come in bare roots or balls or whatever. We're more talking about potted things that you just get from your garden center or nursery, and how to plant them for good success. So let's jump into this. So I'm going to give some general planting advice to begin with. So most perennials that you buy from the garden center will actually have advice on them about how far away you should plant them from other plants, what space you should give them. I do think that's good to read. However, I generally use the rule of thumb, a hand's width. If I can get a hand between the plants, kind of like this, more ideally like this, but this will be fine. That's good for me. I want quite close planting. I want all my perennials to come up in a way where no dirt can be seen at all. If you want a bit more space, then maybe follow the guidelines a bit more exactly. But when it comes to planting perennials and flowers and things like that, I think that's a good rule of thumb that you can use. I also highly recommend actually placing the pots where you want them to go in your border, especially if you're creating one from scratch, so that you can really see and get an idea of how things will look before you commit to it. And also, you definitely want to look into more details about your plants, maybe go on the RHS, the Royal Horticultural Society website, which gives you a ton of information about your plants to see how tall they grow. For example, this phlox I've got here is a really low growing variety, so I want this right at the very front, right at the edge here. If I planted it somewhere back there in the middle, you wouldn't be able to see it. So in the middle, since this flower bed goes all the way around, I've got really tall things, so they're not blocking the view of anything. That's kind of a mistake I made a lot, so I think it's important to know the plant's eventual sizes, because you're not going to get a very good idea just from seeing them in a little pot. Another good thing to remember is the conditions your plants like. Some plants like to be in really free draining soil, sandy soil. Some plants like to be in heavy clay, believe it or not. Again, this is information you can get online, and I recommend you do your research, find the right plants for your type of garden soil. Maybe you don't know exactly what type of soil you've got, but I think you should better generally tell if it's kind of heavy clay or not by doing some digging around, or if it's quite free draining. You can do some different tests, but definitely learn that before you start planting things. Now, I'm quite lucky. My soil is somewhere in the middle. It's pretty free draining. It's not the most free draining you can get, but it's definitely not clay at all. So, somewhere sort of in the middle. So I can basically plant a lot of different things. And for this phlox, like I said, I'm going to plant this really small one right in the middle and show you how I do that. Now, you'll get a lot of different advice about how deep you should dig the hole. Personally, for me, I just like to make sure that when I put it in, the top of the plant, the bit that's protruding from the soil or compost underneath, is covered. You don't want to plant it too deep. You don't want to do that mistake where you're basically covering all of these beautiful stems with soil. You'll just kill it. Plant too low, that's a problem. There was actually a saying for this, but I can't remember what it is now. And if you plant too high, you don't make your hole high enough and it's sitting like out here and so much the plant is exposed, that's not good either. So put your little plant in. If it kind of is leveled up with the ground, I think that's good. I've done that my whole life planting things and had success, so that works for me. Other people might disagree, but that's how I go when actually digging the hole. Now, like I said, things like different types of soil. With this phlox, it's kind of almost like an alpine sort of plant. This likes really sort of dry, free draining conditions. It doesn't want to sit in water. That will just kill it. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put in a bit of this horticultural gravel. You could just use any other type of gravel. This is just one I've got to hand. But I'm going to sort of mix this into the hole just so that it's a bit more free draining. I think this is always a good thing. And if you've got clay soil, I would definitely recommend mixing in some horticultural grit, gravel, Horticultural grit may be a bit better, in my opinion, for clay soil. That'll just help drainage, because as we know, clay soil isn't good for draining things at all. It holds that moisture and things get waterlogged, so you definitely need something to help with the drainage. Now this one's pretty good already, as you can see lots of roots are exposed, but if your plant is root bound, aka it's been in a pot for so long that all the roots just go around in circles and they seem kind of constricted, just give a rub around the plant to try and gently loosen and tease out some of these roots. Because if they're just going around in circles, it's not going to grow very strong. You want these roots nice and loose and exposed so they can go through the soil and really start to grow fast. That'll help you out a lot, in my opinion. Now, all we have to do now is really put it into the hole. And if that hole seems like a good sort of depth for this and you're happy with the positioning of it, you can start to backfill it. This is kind of difficult to do with one hand, so I might not be doing it the best I usually would, but generally this will give you a sort of idea. Make sure you fill in that hole completely, any of the excess dirt you've used, and if you need to top it up with compost or topsoil, you can do that. Now, I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure you plant it sort of even with the level of the soil, so it's nice and secure. But another thing I recommend doing is after you've filled in that soil around the edges of the plant and it's got enough soil, you properly firm it down, because you'll notice that soil starts to sink a lot from where you've dug in. So just use the palm of your fist. If you're planting a tree or a shrub, you might want to use your actual feet, because your fist's probably not going to secure something that heavy. But as you can see, big gaps now. So again, I'm going to put in more soil, more compost, just to make sure it's nice and secure in the ground, and it's not going to have a bad time, basically. And now this little phlox, which, to be fair, I could have probably planted it a little bit closer. I might move it yet, but it's going to creep towards the edge of this border and make things really, really nice, which I'm looking forward to. It's a sort of creeping plant that'll provide a lot of good ground cover. So a lot of it is just knowing where to plant things and knowing the sort of best situations of where they'll grow well and where they'll look nice, and trying to visualize things before you actually plant them is really helpful. I would also generally recommend with most things that you plant that you put in some compost as well. Just get a handful of compost, and that'll add some good nutrients to where you're planting. Basically, it'll give your perennials a little head start. With this phlox, this guy doesn't really want that sort of thing. It's not really interested in those nutrients. So again, use the RHS website to search for your plants and see whether they like that sort of thing. It'll give you all that information, which is really useful, because truly every plant is different. What some might love, others might absolutely hate. And I didn't really feel like this phlox needed any of that compost, just some gravel to help it with the drainage. Now, for trees and shrubs, like these two that I've got here in pots, it's generally the same sort of thing. However, I would actually follow the advice that they give listed a bit more. Things like trees, which obviously can be quite expensive, and shrubs, which also can be quite expensive, will have more detailed advice on them about how you should plant them for success. And I know it sounds kind of lazy me saying this, like, why don't I just teach you? But really the best advice I could give would be to follow the advice that they share for each specific plant, because I don't really think there is a one rule fits all sort of approach for planting shrubs and trees like there is perennials. These guys need something a bit more specific, I would say, just because, this is a massive plant. It's going to have a lot more roots. It's going to be a lot bigger than a tiny little phlox, for example. So yeah, I would always recommend checking what they say in terms of spacing. They'll also mention how deep you should dig the hole. It's just a good idea. I mean, I think some people would generally just throw this sort of stuff away right away. Don't. Hang on to it and take a look. With smaller shrubs like this, which aren't going to get too big, it's pretty much the same as planting perennials. You'll even get some perennials in this size. This is like a 2-liter pot. This is a lot bigger, so again, you're going to need a much deeper pot. They generally say plant 2 times the size of the pot, I believe, but again, it's not the same advice to every tree, so I highly recommend checking that out for each tree and shrub, just so you don't make any mistakes. So yes, that is my advice. I use the RHS website for everything. This video isn't sponsored or anything like that, of course not. It's just what I use, and I found it so helpful. I've got so many different types of plants in this sort of perennial garden area. I've got trees, I've got shrubs, and of course so many perennials. And yeah, I've had success with how I plant them, so I hope you will too. Happy gardening. Make sure to like and subscribe for more gardening content.